Okay, so I'm going to talk about a different sacred city. It's possibly not really a city, actually. They called it a hamlet, so a sacred hamlet. There's about 250 houses there, and people in the winter it's snowy, so people don't live there in the winter. They live there in the summer. So I'll tell you a little bit about this place. Um, Before though, the reason that it's so significant for me is that I spent my a lot of my life really now um, thinking about spiritualism and studying it, this religious movement. And in my for my PhD, I was researching spiritualism as it's kind of expressed in Bristol, in suburban Bristol. And I'd attended spiritualist churches. I've been to the Arthur Findlay College, which is at Stansted Hall in by London, which is the headquarters of the Spiritualist National Union. And all of these places, are very interesting, but they're like pockets of this culture of spiritualism. And what I found really interesting about Lilydale, which I'll talk about now, is that it was a place where this culture of spiritualism was the kind of building blocks, the starting place for what they were doing there. And it was baked into the kind of place itself. Um, and there's a few reasons for that as well. So it was really interesting to see something that I was very familiar with from my research, but that was actually kind of really established, embedded in a particular place, and where pretty much everyone kind of knew about it. It wasn't a fringe thing, like it is around here. So that's why it was really interesting to me. And I just also say that I went there I traveled there from London with my friend Christopher Joseph, who has written a great book, if you're interested in the paranormal, about Jeff the Talking Mongoose, which was this poltergeist case on the Isle of Man in the 1930s. And we had a great time talking about weird stuff. And we explored Lilydale ourselves. Um, we got there by walking over the bridge at Niagara Falls. So we landed in Canada and walked across the bridge into the USA. And we were very apprehensive about that because of all the things that we'd heard in the news about tourists being detained and all of this kind of stuff. But it was fine. It was actually very easy. And I never thought in my life really that I would ever see Niagara Falls. I'd never planned to, and the only reason why I ended up seeing it was because I was going to Lilydale. Um, so it was amazing. And it was the start really of an amazing week. This is where Lilydale is. You can see on the map here. It's in New York State. It's up right by the border with Canada. In fact, Lilydale is by the lake. This is the Great Lakes. I was amazed to see these. I never thought that I would see Great Lakes like this. It was like the sea. It was like the ocean. You couldn't see to the other side of it, and there was ships and things on it. So much bigger than the lakes that I know around here. Um, and it was right out in the countryside, really, in a rural location. It's kind of in wilderness. It's in forests. And it's only, as I say, kind of occupied during the summer months. It's very pleasant, but in the winter, it's kind of difficult to live there. But people have been living around these parts for thousands of years, and this whole area, where Lilydale is, this whole Great Lakes area, was the territories of the homelands of the Haudenosaunee and the Erie peoples, like Lake Erie, which was nearby. And Haudenosaunee means the kind of house builders. They were house building. And it's an alliance of six indigenous nations. Sometimes it's referred to as the Iroquois Confederacy. And they are the Mohawk, the Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and the Tuscarora. Okay, so that was interesting. I went to a reservation and it was a super amazing, interesting experience. And in many ways, it was very similar to the rest of the place. They had petrol stations and everything, all these kinds of, things. It was just like a modern kind of place, except that the arts changed. The designs of the place were different. It was all indigenous designs. The petrol stations looked amazing, and people go onto the reserve because they can get cheaper petrol and stuff there as well. Anyway, it was interesting to see something that was very familiar, but again, it's coming from a different starting place. And it was nice to go and see. So you can see Lilydale is down here in New York State, and then here are these major tribal areas. So that's interesting. And there is a strong thread of indigenous Native American kind of involvement with Lilydale, even in the early days of the place. And Lilydale itself is next door to a lake called Lake Cassadaga. And there was a kind of a splinter group from Lilydale that founded another group called Cassadaga in Florida, where the spiritualists would go for the winter months down to Florida. So there's a kind of a twin spiritualist community in Florida that's attached to Lilydale. And you can see the amazing landscape here. It's very marshy ground. They told us that Lilydale itself used to be an island, and it was parts of it were kind of drained to make a land bridge across because it used to flood. But it was initially a kind of an island in amongst the lakes. And there's lots of wildlife, obviously, that inhabits this place. It's surrounded by these old growth forests. They have an interesting strategy for dealing with trees in Lilydale, in the grounds that they have there, where they just let them do what they want. They don't kind of manage them. If they fall over a path, an established walking route or something like that, then they'll come and move it. But generally, if a tree falls, it's left where it falls, and all of the natural processes are allowed to kind of happen. So the place is amazing, really, and kind of a forest that is doing its own thing. And some of the trees that are there are thought to be, 200, 400-year-old trees, which is amazing. Again, when I go to a forest around here, the trees are often, not that old. They were cut down, in the 19th century to build ships for the Navy. Whereas in America, there's so much more space and wilderness and pockets of trees that have been able to continue to grow for a long time. It has lots of ancient trees, lots of different species, red oaks, eastern hemlock, red maples, all sorts of interesting things. And yeah, I thought some of the trees are very old and ancient trees. And in Lilydale, they have a story about a tradition around this healing tree that's no longer there anymore. Um, but people used to go up to this particular tree for healing. And we'll see healing is a huge part of what was going on in Lilydale, always has been. There's all sorts of interesting wildlife, some things that I was familiar with. So this was actually a hummingbird hawk moth, and we have them around here, surprisingly. And they look like tiny little hummingbirds. There was all sorts of different kinds of frogs and things. I saw these little frogs called peepers. There was black squirrels, rabbits. I saw chipmunks, a heron. There was a toad. We saw a snake, all sorts of things, and even fireflies as well, which I'd never seen before. And they they had this lovely orange glow. And this just reminds me of my idea that I had in this book, Greening the Paranormal, of psychodiversity being a kind of a component of biodiversity. So we have lots of life. You also have obviously lots of minds as well, the minds of the plants and animals and things that are there. So this land is full, abundant with biodiversity. It's a lovely fungus and a slug, a Lilydale slug. Okay. And then there's the town itself, which is a very interesting and very beautiful place. It is specifically a spiritualist town. And so everyone who lives there is, in one form or another, a spiritualist. There's actually about 6 different spiritualist churches who kind of occupy Lilydale, and they all have slightly different teachings. So there's some interesting things to do with, contested spaces as well, with, what counts as real spiritualism and stuff like that. We don't have time to get into that in too much detail. The town was founded in 1879. It was initially called the Cassadaga Lake Free Association, and it was established as a camp for spiritualists and freethinkers. And this meant that it became a really popular place for people to come and talk about all sorts of different topics. And it was a huge center for the women's suffrage movement. And Susan B. Anthony, one of the leaders of the American women's suffrage movement, used to do her lectures here. She did a big lecture here in 1891 that had 3,000 people in attendance. So, it was a real kind of a hub of activity. And spiritualism had always been attached to women's suffrage. Mediums were often women and, were given a platform. We talk about platform mediums, given a platform to speak from at a time when, they didn't necessarily have that in the mainstream. So there's lots of interesting stuff to do with that, spiritualism, women's suffrage. And there's a great museum there that has all sorts of memorabilia from the women's suffrage movement, as well as the spiritualist movement. They're all intertwined with each other. These are just a few of the early photos of the camp in the 1800s. A little bit later on. This was in the house that we were staying in, an old pamphlet that tells you the kinds of activities that were going on back in the day. And you can just see some of the things on here. These are the adverts for different people in the town. There's trance mediums, there's a clairvoyant trance medium, trumpet mediums, magnetic healers, all sorts of different kinds of things. People doing, like a spirit photography and stuff like that. Even today, when you go there, you walk down the streets and outside pretty much everyone's house, there's a little sign hanging out the door that says clairvoyant or medium, or where they do some kind of, a paranormal practice. So an amazing, amazing place. The buildings are all these timber wooden buildings. It's organized really quite easily on a kind of a grid. So it's easy to get around. Most people drive around in golf carts. And that's fun. This is the Healing Temple. It's established in 1955 by Mae West. Very interesting, Hollywood icon, who was also apparently, according to her autobiography, a trumpet medium. And this is when people would go into a trance and spirit voices would talk through a physical trumpet. I had a lovely session. One of the first things we did was go and have a healing session in the Healing Temple. And all my aches and pains were gone for the whole week, which was lovely. There's other kinds of famous characters attached to Lilydale as well. One of them, interesting indigenous connection, is a Chief Oscanonton, who was Mohawk chief. He was also a baritone opera singer, and he did a lot of kind of traveling around, teaching about the Native American way of life, but also singing opera. He was also an actor, did lots of interesting things, and he lived in Lilydale. He died there in 1955. There's lots of interesting, little information boards about the people who lived in Lilydale. Okay, so I've been to other places in the past, like Institute in California, which is a kind of a, it's a part of the New Age and hippie movement kind of thing. And when I was there, I felt a real, even though Esalen itself, the name of it comes from the Esalen tribe, there was no kind of representation of it when I was there. And what I found at Lilydale was that actually there was an acknowledgement of the indigenous people who had lived there and been involved with the place as well, which was very, very interesting. And I heard a guy down there by the lake one day doing a kids session, and they were singing Lakota songs to the cardinal points and telling the kids where the different spirit beings lived in each of the directions. which was amazing. So it felt a connection to the indigenous world as well. And his Forest Temple. One of the main kind of sacred spots at Lilydale is something called Inspiration Stump. And there is an outdoor, they have outdoor services, mediumship services there every day in the morning and in the afternoon. And in the old days, the mediums would stand on the tree stump and give their sermons and their readings from the stump. Today, they don't actually stand on the stump anymore, and actually, the stump is a kind of concrete version of the original stump, uh, unfortunately. But it's still there, and I went to a service here as well, and yeah, had a weird, interesting mediumship reading there too. But it's a fascinating place, and people. This here it is in back in the heyday when I wasn't this nowhere near this many people in the kind of audience. Back in the day, these events attracted huge numbers of people. This is also a great thing that reminded me of Nick when I saw it, because Nick always talks about coffee shops as sacred spaces, and the coffee shop in Lilydale is called Sacred Grounds, and which is nice, but it also is the coffee grounds as well. And in the in the cafe, all of the drinks are named after famous mediums. So it was quite fun to decode the drinks. If you're a spiritualism nerd like I am. And we went in there every morning and I had a bagel and coffee. Lovely. This is the main kind of assembly hall. It's not called the assembly hall, it's called the auditorium. And this is the same building that's there today. And you can see it has these walls that can kind of open up. And it's the same today because it gets so hot and humid. You can open up the sides of the building. And when we were doing our talks, the building was opened up at the sides. And there's me doing my talk about paranormal objects. Okay, so I'm going to rush through this now. You might not know much about spiritualism, but it was a movement that started in 1848 in Hydesville in New York State, so not far away from Lilydale. It involved these sisters, the Fox sisters, and basically they started to hear knocks and bangs in their house, and they started to sort of communicate with it. They realized that if they asked, one knock for yes and two knocks for no, they could establish a conversation. And they started to do this, and eventually this spirit revealed that there was a dead body down in their basement. So they went down into the basement. Sure enough, they found the remains of a skeleton there. And apparently it was a guy who had been a peddler, so an itinerant kind of salesman who had been murdered, before the Fox family had moved in and buried in the basement, along with his peddler's box. And news of this spread rapidly, and they became kind of celebrities, and it all kind of kicked off from there. And other people started to imitate them and do similar things. Anyway, at Lilydale, they moved the Fox family house to the site. So this is interesting what Bernadette was talking about, moving ancient things into different places. They brought the Fox family house all the way from Hydesville. They had deconstructed it. They floated it along the lake, and then they transported it from the lake to Lilydale. It burned down though in the 1950s. There's another interesting thing to do with the kind of agency of the building, and maybe it didn't actually want to be moved. Anyway, it ended up burning down, and all that's left there now is the plaque, and you can see the foundations of the house. But in the museum, they have these relics from the which is, for me, an amazing. This is the start of the spiritualist movement. This is the peddler's box, the dead peddler that they found in the cellar. And these are parts that were left over from the burning of the building. It's a shame that it was destroyed, but amazing to see. And there were all sorts of other kinds of relics in the museum of the spiritualist movement, old newspaper reports. This is Andrew Jackson Davis, he was called the Poughkeepsie Seer. He was kind of like a precursor of spiritualism. He was like a metaphysical kind of philosopher. and he became embedded into the spiritualist movement. You can see the spirit trumpets, lots of crazy paranormal photos of levitating objects and things. These little busts of the Fox sisters are pretty cool. And I found these things were really cool. Aura goggles for seeing auras with. And these are just other examples of spirit trumpets. And when I was doing my field work in Bristol, I went to seances where they still use these spirit trumpets. And I saw them floating around in the room and things like that. You can see they put a kind of fluorescent or a glow in the dark strap on them so that you can see them in the dark. So they had lots of trumpets there. And these bottles were great. Clairvoyant remedies, psychic remedies. Who knows what they contained, but amazing. This is what I mean. Like this psychic and paranormal stuff is just a part of the way things are there. It's in the bottles. We don't really see that around here. This is in the hotel. This tapestry was made by a woman who in trance. She was in trance for years, bedbound, and she made these tapestries, which were shown in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and now they're back in Lilydale. And you also have these kind of spirit drawings of famous spirit guides, which you see in lots of different spiritualist contexts. There's also a lot of interesting stuff to do with fairies there. There's a trail called the Fairy Trail, and it's a bit tacky in some ways. Um, there are lots of little gnomes and plastic fairies and things all scattered around on this trail. And this is another interesting point on contested spaces. There's disagreement in the community about whether this is appropriate, whether fairies would appreciate this. And they have moved the trail um, in recent years to a different part of the woods because they thought that the beings in that part of the woods were offended by this. But I found it quite kind of quaint. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is some of the experiences that I had when I was there wandering around. The first one I already mentioned was when we arrived there and we went in for a spiritual healing in the morning. And basically, this was like a passing of hands. We got called up one by one to come and sit on a chair, and then the healers would pass their hands over us. And I'll just say that she had really, really warm hands. But I genuinely felt really good after that. I don't know what it was. I wasn't kind of on a little holiday as well. But as soon as we came outside, we heard these sort of mechanical buzzing sounds up in the trees, high up in the trees, and they seemed to be moving from tree to tree. And we talked to other people about them. Some people who lived there, they didn't quite know what they were. There were cicadas and things like this, but these sounded very strange. Anyway, they probably were insects, but we were like, wow, this is amazing. There's so many things about this place that kind of attract your attention. The other thing that happened, which was in the assembly, we had a spoon bending session, and I've already mentioned my bent spoon. Um, but there was probably about maybe I can't remember, it's like 50, 60 people in the room, and everyone's spoons bent. And we were told to kind of make friends with our spoon and talk to it and kind of ask its permission to bend and these kind of things. And I started to read on it, and it says Oneida community made. And the Oneida people were one of the, these indigenous communities around there. And they're also known as the people of the Standing Stone. So once I started to pay attention to my spoon, all of this interesting stuff started to come out about the Oneida people, and the Oneida people transformed into standing stones as their origin story, which is very apt. I was talking about magic stones as well. Anyway, and my spoon bent, and now I have my own permanent paranormal object, which is lovely. Yeah, you can see the Oneida tribe right by Lilydale. So this spoon, there's also there's a Oneida cutlery company, So they mass produce these. Interesting. And then the last thing I'm going to mention is the most strange experience that I had, and probably one of the most strange experiences I've ever had, when it was on the last night. And we were, me and Christopher were asked if we wanted to go down into the woods um, with George Hansen, who is a writer in the paranormal field, and his partner Elizabeth. And we also went with a guy called Doug Harlow, who's actually a weather man. And we went down into the woods, and basically, as we were going down, Elizabeth was throwing sweet treats into the woods on either side. And she took us down to this spot where it started to get boggy. You remember, it used to be an island, so there's lots of sort of boggy bits. And then when we got down there, she said, they like it when you sing. So we started to sing a few different songs, like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and 10 Green Bottles and these kind of things. It was very similar to what you do in a seance, really. And specks of light in seances as well. But these little specks of light started to flash right up high up in the trees. Remember, I mentioned that we'd seen fireflies the night before, which were these. They were low down for one thing, and they kind of puffed like a puff of light, of orange light, and then it faded down. And these little specks of light were really up high in the trees, and they were blue, little blue pricks of light. And it was on one of the second time when we sang Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. These two little blue lights came down, and they came to about a meter away from where I was. And they almost seemed to leave a little kind of like a trail behind them as they came down. And they kind of hovered there while we were singing. And I turned to Christopher and I tapped him on the shoulder because I didn't want to, I didn't know if I was imagining this. And I wasn't imagining it. He confirmed that he could see them as well. And they just sort of faded away. They didn't fly off. They just faded away slowly. I don't know whether they receded into the distance. So it's pretty weird. I didn't know what they were. I'm perfectly open to the possibility that they were insects who like singing. It's one possibility. Um, but they didn't behave like normal insects, and their behavior suggested to me, anyway, a kind of intriguing. They were intrigued by what we were doing. They were inquisitive and coming down to check. Um, they move differently and all of this kind of stuff. And I asked Elizabeth what she thought they were, and she said that they don't like the F word. And I was like, what do you mean they don't like the F word? And I thought, and then she said F word as in fairies. They don't like to be called fairies, which was very interesting. And it turned out that there are different kind of factions again within Lilydale who know about these things, but they don't know where some people think that they're fairies and some people think that they are woodland spirits or something like that. But apparently, this is a regular occurrence. It's not something that's particularly special. And in fact, other people I spoke to later on said that they'd seen even much more intense things than that down there. I'm hoping that I can go back there next year and have another look. Anyway, it was pretty weird. This is a photo that was taken just afterwards. You can see how frazzled we are. Being down in the woods at night on the last day and seen some pretty weird stuff. And this is George Hansen, who is a real kind of pioneer. His book, The Trickster and the Paranormal, is a true classic, epic book that binds together anthropology and parapsychology. And yeah, so that was my little trip to Lilydale. There's just a few little conclusions then. There's lots and lots of layers of activity. There's all the indigenous stuff that was going on for thousands of years before, you know, Europeans arrived. There's the whole free thought and women's suffrage movement that's bound up in that place, and spiritualism. It's in this wilderness area with the lakes and the kind of 200-year-old, 400-year-old trees. Yes, we might contribute to this idea of psychodiversity.
Have we lost Jack? I think we've just lost him for a second. That was a great presentation. It's really
I just
good.
did that saying the people
Oh yeah, back, Jack, you're back.
there are all these physical.
No, he's gone. Yeah. That was great. I like to hear he's coming
Just
back in. Great. That was
I'll finish, yeah.
fantastic. What I loved about it, and that final slide, yeah, and that final slide, you're actually really covering everything that the students should cover in their research projects. You know, just the different, not everything on it, but the, you know, the you've explained the terrain.